Welcome to Your Intended Message, the perfect place for leaders and promising professionals who want to convey the intended message for greater success. Every week, we interview experts who can help you communicate more effectively, whether that's one-to-one, one-to-few, or one-to-many. And perhaps the most important conversation, one-to-self. I'm your host, George Torok. My guest today is Shelle Rose Charvet. Shelle is back. You might recall her visit from an earlier show where we talked about how to influence others and how to listen more carefully to the types of language they use to see where their motivations are coming from and how you can reach them. Shelle, as you might have guessed, is an expert in influencing and persuasion. She's the author of the best-selling book, Words That Change Minds. It's now available in at least 15 languages. Shelle works with organizations around the world. She's now working remotely, like many of us, and she helps organizations understand what really motivates your clients. And finally, the third piece of information about Shelle that would be helpful is that she's currently living in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. She spends time in Berlin because her hubby is a Berliner. And as you might also guess, Shelle is a student of languages. Of course, she speaks English, French, and Spanish, and she's working on her German.
Das ist wichtig.
Ein Bier bitte. That's my German. Shelle, welcome to Your Intended Message.
Thank you so much, George. Pleasure to be back with you.
Great talking with you. The last conversation was certainly stimulating, and I'm sure that listeners, some of them had those aha moments just to pay better attention to the way we use and interpret words. Mm-hmm. Let's go deeper on that topic today, and let's deal with how we deal with how best, if there's a best, how best to deal with controversy and conflict, because ideally we want our words to make things better, not create wounds. So how can we fix and move toward that goal?
Yeah. So I'm listening to you. George is using some of the techniques that we talked about in the previous podcast about how some people want to move away from a problem and some people want to move towards. And George was using both of those languages. So if you're interested in how to use that kind of language to engage people, we covered that in the last podcast. So you're talking about controversy and conflict. And everyone has noticed people take definitive positions and then somebody argues with them, and it escalates incredibly rapidly online to people calling each other names. And then, as you know, you're Hitler or you're a Nazi. It ends up that way often enough. And people can be really unsure of how to answer. You can see I was unsure of what to say there. And should they reply? Is there anything you can do that's helpful? And those are good questions. I don't think you always need to reply or you always should reply. But sometimes if you're involved in a group and you say nothing, it's really like you're condoning what's going on. And you don't always have to get involved in the content of the issue. You can pull things back to a higher level. You can zoom out and think about, listen, if we want to have a productive or a more productive conversation, maybe it's easier to do it this way. Or if we want to avoid things escalating, my suggestion would be that we handle it in a particular way. And that's what I want to talk about. What is that particular way? So first of all, is it a good idea to intervene or not? Then realize if you don't intervene, whoever it is that's doing those things believes they have your tacit approval and everyone else that's in that particular group. Very recently, I was talking to a friend who is involved in a online coaching group, and someone made a very racist remark. And I was talking to somebody else in that group. I'm not in that group. And he said, I was really uncomfortable and I didn't say anything. Well, the third person in the conversation, who's a person who is Black, of color, she says, I am so tired of these remarks and having to be the only one who says anything, and no one says anything else. And I thought, they don't say things because they're uncomfortable and they don't know how to talk. But the problem with not speaking up is it's approved. The last comment was approved. Nobody disagreed with it. And so I think it's important to know how to disagree. And of course, you don't always have to jump in on every fight. You got to pick your fights, but how to disagree. And the easiest thing is to zoom out and look at the conversation. And in this case, what was happening was clearly violating the values of that group. So someone could come in and say, listen, when you said this, it was, in my opinion, and stand behind your opinion, it's violating this and this values of this group. And in this group, we want to aim for this kind of thing and not do that kind of thing. If you come out and you go, you're a racist, that doesn't get anybody anywhere. And sure, there may be a person who's a racist. There may be a person who was thoughtless or wasn't thinking about the implications of what they were saying. Somebody who didn't mean to exclude anybody. But these aggressions hurt people. And that's what I think a lot of people don't realize. If you say nothing, other people get hurt. And you're left wondering, should I have said something? Like, what are my values? Like, is it important for me to encourage people to communicate well? Like, or am I just going to stay out of this fight? And then whatever happens, I have no impact on. So there's a lot of philosophical questions as well as tactical and strategic questions to answer. I don't know. What do you think, George?
Is that options language? What do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking about different ways of looking at this. Very good, George. It's picking up my patterns now. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm studying at the feet of the great master. What do I think? You know, I don't really know. I don't know. I know that when people say things, and if I'm part of a group, I expect everyone to show respect for the people there, every one of us, both with the things we say and the things we do, and whether or not it's a formal group, you know, like a coaching group, or whether it's just an informal gathering, there are still some rules, implied rules of engagement of, hey, we're people here, we're individuals, we each have value. And just because you don't like what someone says, it doesn't mean you label them or you make an inappropriate racist, sexist comment. So I think
one of the people in a group where I was actually pointing out some good deeds of a particular government, somebody else then came in and told me all the reasons why I was wrong, and then called me a lefty shrill. So my response was, well, as a lefty shrill, and then I responded back. So, and now when this person talks to me, I jokingly refer to myself as a lefty shrill. And that's one way of dealing with it. You don't have to take everything so seriously, right? And I notice he's more polite with me. Like, I made my point, but in a funny way, right?
That's clever. That's clever, and more people probably don't think of doing that, and they should. So instead of defending and attacking, use the words in a funny way, and just show them that it doesn't offend you. You know, silly comment like that. Come on, and that's who I am. If that's who you want to paint me as, okay, then I'll play.
That's okay for me to do it with me, but I don't think that's okay if somebody made a sexist or a racist remark or attacked someone else. I'm not going to then make a joke of it because I don't agree with those tactics. So there's that timing and there's that kind of thing. And in that case, you're probably asking yourself the question like, oh, well, what would you do then? And then I would say, hey, let's have a conversation about this. Let's not attack people, right? Would you be okay to do that? Like, let's and invite people to let's continue the conversation because people had interesting ideas, and if we're just attacking people, we're not actually exploring anything. Now, you don't have to invite them to continue the conversation. Maybe the conversation was really stupid and people were espousing extreme views. You can just make your point about how to talk about it. And if you do that consistently, people who are participating in those forums on whatever forum it is, know that you're going to make that comment afterwards, and they tend to self-edit a bit more and become, and it's not overnight, like there's a process involved. They tend to, in my experience anyway, to become more factual and less personal attacking. Yeah.
Mm. What about conflict in the workplace?
That's a big question.
It is a big question, and the question. Let me be more specific. Let me drill down a little bit. How do you, when you work with organizations, you work with organizations all around the world, you help them with their communication issues, everything from marketing to internal communication. When you work with an organization and they say, Shelle, can you come in? Our team is just not working well. Everybody hates everybody. They're fighting. Do you tell them, well, maybe just fire them all?
Yeah, you just stop it. Yeah. And that solves everything. No.
Just put your foot down and tell them, well, this is going to end right
Give
now.
them hell. Yeah, really. Yeah. So what often is going on is that the meta conversations are not happening. And you see this in families too. We don't talk about certain things. We feel tension and people are walking gritted teeth, or they're civil and polite, and then behind each other's backs they're with a knife. And a lot of that can be solved by earlier finding out what the disagreements are and making sure it's okay. So I want to talk first about prevention and then cure. I have a small team. My team is multicultural. They work from different countries around the world. Some of them are digital nomads, some of them are not. So some of them you don't know where they are until they tell you. And some of them are on completely different time zones, night and day. And for me, it's really important that we be effective, productive, and that we have fun. I'm only in this because it helps other people and it's fun. And I want to be both productive and fun, have fun. And so one of the things we institute in our team, and I've seen this in really great teams, is permission to disagree, permission to say, I'm not very comfortable with this. And I actually frame it so that my team knows how to talk about something. And look at people. If their face is going, like, you can say, I get the sense you're not comfortable with something. Can you tell us? Like, be invitational and ask people to tell you more. Because usually in there somewhere, even if it's originally expressed as a negative, is a great suggestion about something. And this way, I don't believe I have to know everything, be in charge of everything. I'm counting on people to tell me when they're not comfortable with something, because it usually puts us on a better path. So that's kind of prevention, to really encourage that meta talking. And I also give a lot of praise and feedback when it's due. People need to be encouraged and supported, particularly from their leadership.
Now, interesting, you used the phrase permission to disagree, and I associate that phrase with the military, because maybe I've seen that in movies.
Permission to disagree, sir. Yeah.
Yes, which I always thought is a great phrase. If only more organizations would make that phrase a standard operating procedure for everyone to be able to tap into, and that would make it less of an argument and a conflict and more of, well, it's just a disagreeing of opinion.
Yeah. So wouldn't you rather have a conversation than a confrontation?
You bet.
Right.
Yeah,
and you can create one of those. Absolutely. And that's about the environment that you set up as a leader. And are people afraid of you? Are they afraid if they disagree that you're going to humiliate them? Hopefully not. And what kind of forms? Some people who are shy and more introverted don't want to necessarily disagree in a meeting, even a virtual meeting, but you can actually find out what they're really thinking. Or you can just invite them to say, you look like you're thinking about something. Can you share it with us? And be open and nod your head while they're talking to encourage those people who are shy and less willing to share their opinions.
Now, Shelley, we're still on the prevention point, and I want to bring out what have you seen leaders do effectively to encourage conversation instead of conflict?
Right. They ask their people if they've talked to so-and-so. And good leaders will also check, are you comfortable with talking to so-and-so? Do you have a sense of how you'd like to have that conversation, what you'd like to say? And then you can offer your coaching or your guidance if the person is saying, this is not the kind of thing I'm used to. Like, I wasn't hired to be Miss Confrontational here. You say, well, how about we talk about what might be a good strategy? Leaders are willing to talk about the process of the communication as well as just what people are going to say. Like, how are you going to deal with this? And I think that those kind of coaching conversations develop people capable of having meta conversations, which you need in any kind of successful relationship. The ability to talk about it, right?
You're calling it meta conversation. Meta meaning the whole message.
Meta means about. So when you have a meta conversation, it's about something. So we are now having a meta conversation about conflict, how to reduce conflict. So we're talking about how are we talking about it, right?
So we talk about the how as opposed to the
content, just the
content.
What. Yeah.
Got it.
So, how would you like to open this conversation? Well, I'd like to open it by having a cup of coffee together, right? So something like that. That's the kind of thing to prevent. And it's a cultural thing. There are lots of cultures. And again, culture is a generalization. I kind of see culture as an umbrella. And not everyone who comes from a certain culture is under that umbrella. So you have to pay attention to individual differences. But there are cultures that are very reticent to talk about conflict, and it's difficult. So I like to talk about it as people having different opinions, or find out what other people are thinking, because the word conflict and even thinking about it gives some people in some cultures are, can't do that, just can't do that. Yeah.
Tell us about the cure.
The cure. So that sounds so definitive. Okay, here is the thing. We see this in the internet marketing. It's the one thing. Well, I kind of don't think there is one thing. So, but I think if there's conflict, somebody has to step up and acknowledge that things are not all rosy. The things are not perfect right now. And I think it's up to the leader to say that. I get the sense that there's a lot of disagreement here that we haven't yet resolved. Keyword, yet. So one of the things we talked about in the previous podcast was putting problems in the past up to now, because you want to give people the possibility that we can fix this, right? If you come in as a leader and say things are not working well, it's like, that's the way it is. There's nothing you can do about it. But if you say, there's things going on and conversations that we haven't had yet, that means that we've been having some conflicts. We've been getting in each other's way. And I'd like to suggest that we could actually find out what each person needs and figure out how we can work this out. And as a mediator, I would go in and I would actually talk to different people, and people tend to be very angry and very hurt. And this is a good thing because it has energy. And you can find out what people are angry about, what they're hurt about, and what they need, and then bring that together in a more of a group meditation process. It's, that's a whole topic on itself, but just think about it. When somebody's angry or they're hurt, they have energy around something. If they're resigned and bitter, they've already given up, and that's much harder to deal with. And then you need to make them angry, so at least they've got some energy around something. So aren't you annoyed about this? Might be a question in that case. I'd be annoyed. Wouldn't you be annoyed about this? Well, because someone who's resigned, it's just, they're coming in to get their paycheck and they're really not they've given up because they believe it's hopeless. And your job is to convince them, well, it's not hopeless, and I'm here, and we're going to figure out how to make this work.
So
right?
anger,
As a leader, that's your job. Yeah.
Anger and being hurt are still a positive sign because I guess it means they care.
Correct. And they have energy to put into this, right? When they're exhausted and depleted and bitter, I'm not bitter, then that's harder. They've given up. So
Got it. Okay. And how do you take the anger or the hurt? How do you build on that? Where do you go from there?
So one thing you might, once you create a rapport and you're having a conversation about this, I might even ask somebody, are you angry enough to want to do something to solve this and participate in a process to solve this? Or are you hurt enough to want to do something to contribute to making this right? That's a great question to ask people. And then you say, I'm here to run this process, but it's not going to work if we don't all participate. So I want to know, are you angry enough to want to participate in finding a solution? Is this unacceptable to you, the current state, and you want to make it better? That's what the question's really saying.
Okay. So there you turn their anger and their hurt into a positive force to move.
A desire to contribute to making it better. Yeah, absolutely. And the question is, are you angry enough to do this? Are you annoyed enough? Or whatever their word is for describing their feeling, right? Are you pissed off enough, for example? Yeah.
Yep, that's what I was thinking. And so, yeah, so how ticked off are you?
Bad word or something, yeah.
Good. And when the managing the conflict, should the leader encourage conflict versus controversy? Do you see a difference between the two?
Well, controversy is unavoidable, I think, today, because people tend to have very polarized views. This is the way it is, and they trigger each other. As soon as one person becomes very polarized and definitive and certain, it's almost impossible to stop yourself unless you have a stop button, from doing the polar opposite, equal but opposite response. That Newton's law of motion, equal and opposite response. So you really have to have a slowing down technique for that. I forget what your question was. What was your question, George?
Well, the conflict, should a leader encourage conflict within the organization, and can conflict be healthy?
So I wouldn't frame it necessarily as conflict. I would frame it as differences. Because the word conflict, again, going back to the cultural umbrella, can trigger a lot of people to go, oh, can't do that. But what about curiosity? A leader can come in and say, listen, I have noticed there's some very different points of view about this, and I'm really curious about that, because I think there's some value in us actually figuring out where we are on this. I was in a board meeting yesterday in which two people had very different opinions about a numbers thing, where these thresholds should be. And what was great is they kept asking each other, well, what is it that you're trying to achieve with this number? Or why is this number important? Like, what is it going to do for us? They asked questions to find out the reasoning rather than just counter arguing. That's an interesting conversation. And in the end, they didn't come to an agreement. In the minutes, it said one person thought this, one person thought that. And a third person went and asked someone else who couldn't attend, who reframed the whole thing and said, and that person came back and said, I was way out in left field. I now understand, blah, 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 blah. But that can only happen if you have an attitude of curiosity rather than an attitude of you're right, you're wrong, right? And it's tempting for the leader to take sides, particularly if one of the parties espouses views that you just are totally against. And we all have views we're totally against right now. But as a leader, breathe, zoom out, and remember, in my role as a leader, what do I need to do here to foster better conversations, to acknowledge the differences, to set boundaries for what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. You can say, like, people got upset at the last meeting and some things were not okay, and make sure you've spoken to those people individually, but the issues we're bringing up are relevant and important. If they are, if you can say the issues we are bringing up are really not relevant to what we're trying to do, I prefer we didn't talk about it. That's your role as a leader. You can decide that. But the issues that are relevant, if you have set an environment in which we discuss differences and we ask people what's behind what they're thinking and we listen, I think we're creating a team environment where everybody gets to grow and everybody gets to be to make a bigger contribution. Yeah. Sorry, that's my rant. I'll get off my soapbox now, but I think leaders can be very inspirational by doing that with their teams. Like, don't you want your teams to think, oh man, this is the best team I've ever worked in because we can work things out? Like, wouldn't that be great for people to say that about you as a leader?
That would be fabulous. And I think especially in a world where we're hoping to encourage diversity in the workplace, in the community, and diversity of sex, religion, race, and mindsets and differences of opinion. If instead of seeing that bringing conflict, we see that as bringing differences of opinion, which we can be curious to explore and build on that.
I totally agree with that, but there's a caveat. I mean, I've just finished taking, and this is 2020, I have finished taking a 6-week course as a student in anti-racism. And one of the things that happened to me, like a lot of things happened to me taking this course, and one of them is I realized by the fact of not getting involved in dealing with systemic racism, like things that are actually built into the system, I've been complicit in it continuing. Like, the fact that I don't get involved to change the system means that I'm kind of thinking things are just okay the way they are. And I'm not saying everybody needs to be on the streets, but you can just Google the question, what are the ways that white people can help end systemic racism? It's all out there on the internet. Like, who do we need to be writing emails to? Who do we need to be commenting on? What are the kinds of things we can do in our own behavior? And I was kind of shocked to realize that I have a value that is treating everybody fairly, and yet I've been doing nothing about systemic racism against Indigenous peoples in Canada, against people of color, etc. I haven't really been doing anything about that. Now, some people might say, well, I don't think there's systemic racism. Well, it's not up to me to think that. Talk to somebody who's been on the receiving end of that their whole lives. I mean, in the very first episode of this course, our trainer, who is a Black woman from the Southern United States who's been living the last 30 years in Paris, she told us about her upbringing. And my experience as a white person has been nothing like that. Like, imagine for a moment if you had to, in every conversation where you were the only person of your color, had to manage the conversation so that the other people would be sufficiently comfortable with your presence that they didn't put you in a corner or accidentally other you because, you're the Black person, so you should know about this, or, well, what's it like in the Black community where suddenly you're not a colleague, you're a representative or something, and not even to mention microaggressions. So, you hear a lot of people going, well, I'm not a racist, but systemic racism isn't about being a good or bad person. It's like, what is going on in the system that gives people an experience of having to be cautious and wary all the time? Can you imagine how exhausting that has to be? And that was a real eye-opener for me.
Yeah, and interesting enough, I experienced, like a white male, white male, everything's just fine with the world, there's no, but I experienced that myself for the first time when I was 20. I backpacked around the world. And when I went, and Europe was easy to travel, but when I went to Asia, and in particular India, where I stood out, I couldn't blend in anymore. People knew I didn't belong there. And I had long hippie type hair as well. I stood out and people stared at me and they treated me differently. And so I became aware of that racism. In my case, it probably worked for me because I was white and I had certain advantages that.
You're very tall. You must have stood up head and shoulders above everybody. Yeah.
Very much, especially when, especially when you're trying to get on a crowded bus or get on a train. But I noticed that, and it made an impact. And come back home, back to the Western world, and now I can blend in. I'm white male, and I'm okay.
And you're bringing up a very important point. As an expert in influencing, one of the things I realized is that it's hard to convince someone of something if they have not had a personal experience of it. It's very easy to reject. People feel this way and they go, well, I don't, so that's very easy to happen. And so one of the things about becoming an anti-racist and someone who wants to do something about the systemic racism is learning how to talk to other people about it. And when, as you go through various and sundry processes, and there's lots of books out there, one that I read, which is actually a personal development book, is called Me and White Supremacy. And it talks about things that are uncomfortable, like white fragility. How often in a company or a team does anybody talk about race? Well, usually we don't. Why? Because white people are very uncomfortable because it feels like it's a personal attack on whether they're a good person or a bad person. So it's much easier to shut those conversations down. It takes courage to turn to a person who's brought that up and say, tell me how you're feeling. Rather than going, oh, we have a diversity policy here and we think everything's okay, or that's not really appropriate for our workplace. It's just, and again, that's shutting down people. A few months ago, somebody in the CBC objected to someone else using the N-word, and her point was, I'm the only Black person here. Does that mean if I weren't here, nobody else would have objected? Right? Like what, and it's hard to know all the do's and rights and wrongs. 3 years ago, things were different and other things were acceptable and now they're not. Everybody's going to make mistakes. We have to be forgiving of each other. But is it up to the Indigenous and Black people to correct our behavior, to correct the systemic injustices to do with how they're treated in the criminal justice system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if it's only up to them, nothing's going to change because they don't have the power to change things.
True. It's encouraging when you do see white people marching with the Black Lives Matter group. There's some of it's getting through.
Yeah. And taking this course was a real eye-opener for me because I didn't realize how hypocritical I've been. Like if it is my value system to believe that everybody should be treated fairly, then why wasn't I involved before? Well, it was part of that's not my problem, and becoming aware of that, and also becoming aware of what it's like to be on the receiving end of all that racism. Now, as a woman, I've been on the receiving end of sexism. When I first applied for my first mortgage in Canada, they wouldn't give it to me because I was a single mother. They said I didn't fit into their algorithm. Well, I'm sure there's lots of other people who don't fit into the algorithm as well. I mean, but that's a minor example. It doesn't happen to me every single day of my life.
Now, there's an interesting point. And Shelle, is a woman and as a master of influence, what techniques have you used or have you found useful, or have you advised other women or minorities to use when they are being dismissed? They're not considered, their opinion isn't valuable to the conversation. What can they do?
This is an important question. And the reason it's an important question is it's too late to figure out what you're going to do when it happens. Because when it happens, that's emotional. And when you're emotional, you can't think logically. I know this sounds obvious, but people cannot be emotional and logical in the same moment. And to develop a strategy, you need to be logical. So you have to already decide the options you have in front of you before anything happens. And really, there's 3 kinds of options. You confront, that means the person says something and you go against it. you agree with it, or you, I'm looking for a word that I can't find. You not distract, but you lead it off in another direction, right? So if you confront, you say, and this may be something you want to do or something you don't want to do. I'm not okay with what you just said. That might be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Or I'm not okay with what you said because I don't believe this is how we work together here in this organization. Or I'm not okay with what you said because I don't want to be treated as if I'm blah, blah, blah.
Or that doesn't feel right to me.
It doesn't feel right to me, or it is not okay. Like you can, you have the right to define what's okay and what's not okay for you. So that's a confrontation. And the agreeing option would be just to say nothing, right? Or go along with it, or pretend it didn't happen. All those are examples of agreeing. People don't realize that, but saying nothing is an agreement, right? In this case, if you're looking for consensus around a room about a decision and somebody says nothing, don't believe that that's agreement. Like if they didn't say yes, it doesn't necessarily mean they agreed. But in this other circumstance that I'm talking about, you say nothing, you're kind of agreeing with what was said and done. And redirecting, that's the word I was looking for. Redirecting it is when you take something, and this takes a bit more creativity, and you kind of have to do this beforehand. You need to reframe it into something else. I remember once when I was living in France, I was in a taxi, and the taxi driver was railing against all the immigrants. This is years ago. So this is an old problem, right? Railing against all the immigrants. And I decided to take a redirect approach. And I said to him, that makes sense. You would say that all these immigrants coming from the colonies that France colonized, and they can't make a living, and now they're coming back here. I understand that why these immigrants are coming back and why it can be annoying to the country that colonized them. And then I said, I wonder if we'll make the same mistakes when we start to colonize the other planets. And now I'm watching the taxi driver in the mirror. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. He's trying to recompute what I was going to say, because he now had to reconfigure how he was thinking about that. Right? Because I zoomed out and looked at it as a whole process. Right.
And who would have ever thought of that perspective? Not me.
Yeah, when we colonize the other planets, right?
When we colonize the other planets, how do you think they're going to feel about us? Yeah. And I can see that poor taxi driver just trying to figure that one out. And, where did you want me to take you again?
Yeah.
My guest today is Shelle Rose Charvet, helping you asking for permission to disagree. If you like what you heard, remember to like, comment, and share this podcast. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you convey your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.